Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Before we begin, I have a couple of administrative notes. First of all, this event is being live streamed and recorded, so I ask that you please remove all DoD and visitor badges at this time. And because this is being live streamed, we have one thing we need to tell you about regarding any questions. If you do have a question, first wait to be acknowledged, then wait for a microphone to come to you. Please speak directly into the microphone, and then return the microphone back to the administrator. Anybody have any questions regarding that? Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, the Director of the Army Staff, Lieutenant General Walter Pyatt.
What he didn't say, unless you're General Les Smith, you can stand up and ask a question anytime. His voice carries, so that's good. Most of us do. Well, hey, thanks a lot for coming today. It's a very special time. I first met Dr. Jha, Amishi Jha. Now she's a very close, dear friend of the Pyatt family. Back in 2010, I was a brigade commander in Hawaii, and we were on the deployment roller coaster like everybody else, year on, year off, since 2001. And we were just trying to do something different when we came back from deployment because, we were just falling to pieces. I mean, you could just see it in the soldiers and families when we came back. We weren't reintegrating, and no matter how good our training or information was on what not to do, we seemed to do the exact opposite. And it just happened faster the more times you were deployed. And we were lucky enough that at that time, Colonel Mike Brumage, who had a Schofield medical clinic, introduced us to Dr. Jha and said, I think she can help. If we can do a study on use of mindfulness for soldiers, it might help with what we're doing. And what we quickly learned, and in 3 minutes, she just described us perfectly. We said, wow, we're really living on fast forward and a fast rewind. We're never really here. And it got my attention right away. And I realized in the Army throughout my whole career, I knew how to stand at attention. I could do it for an hour straight in the blazing sun, and I wouldn't even move to swat a fly off my nose, but I didn't know how to pay attention. And we weren't really ever in the moment. And as we started this practice of mindfulness, what we quickly learned is it really wasn't for recovery, it was for performance enhancing. It taught us how to regulate our stress and to be in the very moment, to be at our very best when things are on the line. Sound familiar? You do it every day here in the Pentagon. And to be there, not be thinking about when's this general going to shut up and when do I get back because my email's piling up right now, or many of you are thinking about that right now, and I want to get out of the office tonight at a certain time because I want to get on the HOV lane so I can get home. That's where your mind just went to, and I'm asking you that you're not paying attention. Well, I first learned it. Now, I won't give you a combat story. Well, kind of a combat story, I think. I went home, and I actually listened to my wife. And I realized I was hearing her all this time, and I could filter it, and I was always formulating my response, solving her problem, because I was the husband. That's what I had to do. But I really just learned to slow down and listen to her. And I realized it was a real beautiful voice. And she said many things. She told me, don't deploy until you deploy. And it was profound guidance, but all those years I knew, as soon as I got back, I was already on the next mission, and I was already thinking about the last mission, and I didn't enjoy the rare moments I had at home. And my son noticed right away. He said, Dad, you're not on your BlackBerry when we talk now. It made a huge difference in my life. I spent moments with my son that I would have never had I been worried about work emails when I should have been just worried about catching a football. Now, those are little examples, but you take this into what we do every day here in the Pentagon, strategic leadership. If we're not listening, how dare we give our best military advice? And if we're not in the moment, how can we discern friend or foe when lives are on the line and our soldiers have to make a decision within a split second? And that decision will have strategic results. This matters. And our Chief of Staff has told us that people are number one priority, and I think there's no better place to start than the mind. And so, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a great welcome for my dear friend, Dr. Amishi Jha.
Wow. Can everybody hear me? Can you see me? Okay. Well, I just want to say what an honor and privilege it is to be here today with all of you. And I want to actually just begin by thanking General Pyatt and Mrs. Pyatt for not only their ongoing support of our work and collaboration, but all these years of friendship. So thank you both very much. I also want to just begin by acknowledging Pam and Eileen, who are part of the initiative that allowed me to be here today, and the entire DAS staff that's been wonderful to coordinate the logistics around being here. So just want to start there. So, I think what I do during my day job as a neuroscience professor may be different than what most of you do. So I thought it might be a good idea to give you a sense. Can you see the slides okay? Text is all right? Good. I want to give you a sense of what I do and the perspective that I'll take in the work that I want to share with you today. So as was already mentioned, as I just mentioned, I'm a neuroscientist, and the bulk of the research in my laboratory has to do with understanding the brain's attention system. So how it is that it is instantiated within the hardware of the brain. And we use various techniques, functional MRI, brainwave recordings, performance, to get a window into how attention works. And one of the things that I can tell you we know for sure, which I think everybody in this room already knows, is that attention is an incredibly important and powerful brain system. In fact, it's so important that sometimes we refer to it as the brain's boss. But like any powerful thing, there is kryptonite. And what we learned through the years of studying how attention works is that the three most potent vulnerabilities for attention are listed up here: stress, poor mood, and threat. And I would say that these are part and parcel of being human. We all experience the ups and downs of life, and this happens to be just part of the human condition. But what I soon realized is that there are certain professions for whom this is not simply the ups and downs of life, but actually descriptive of what it means to engage in your professional life. It's that these kinds of circumstances that force people in and you want to operate at your highest, when now we know that attention is most vulnerable under these circumstances. So after realizing that not only is attention powerful, it's vulnerable, I became very interested in understanding how we might train it to be stronger and function better. And that's where the work on mindfulness actually enters my lab, as a brain training or cognitive training tool. And we've learned a lot over these years, and I'm happy and excited to have the opportunity to tell you about that. But now you'll know where I'm coming from this research perspective. All right, so I'm the only one standing here, but I just do want to acknowledge that science is a team sport, and there's many people that are behind what I'm going to say to you today. I'm very grateful that some of the key people that have been my supporters and collaborators are in this room right now. And I also want to just acknowledge the funders, because without the funding, we couldn't have conducted any of this research, right? And what I'm essentially wanting to report back is this is what has happened. This is what has come from our research effort over the last several years. This is what DoD dollars have allowed us to learn. And now I hope that what I share with you will be helpful directly back to the DoD's efforts. So that's the kind of spirit behind what I want to share. All right, so let's talk about the roadmap, what I want to get into in the 45 minutes or 40 minutes now or so that we have. The first thing I want to do is actually talk a little bit more about attention. What is it, and why is it so important? The second thing we'll do is get into mindfulness. And just curious, how many of you, before you learned about this lecture, had heard the term mindfulness? Wow! I wish I had a camera to take a picture of that. That's amazing. That's wonderful. I mean, I think that says something about its moment right now. Sometimes that's good news, because that means that you're getting good information about mindfulness, and there's also a possibility that what's being conveyed may not be exactly what I mean when I say it. So we're going to talk a little bit about it to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to what mindfulness actually is and how it relates to attention. And then the third thing I want to do is go from sort of the theoretical or broad background to delving into the details. If it is the case that attention is so important and vulnerable, and mindfulness does in fact strengthen attention, well, what are the best practices that we can offer people such as yourselves that are extremely time pressured, yet what you do matters critically, not only for yourselves, but for a whole host of other people? How can we offer these tools and techniques in the most time efficient way with the most potent ability to benefit? So that's where we're going, but here's the first piece of data I will share with you, and this number. What does this number reflect? This number is the amount of time people are actually paying attention to their task at hand. And this is not just me making it up. This is research study after research study. Think about what that means. In any given moment, if you make eye contact with somebody and you're actually talking to them, there's a 50-50 chance that they're actually there, right? And in the 40 minutes I have left now, you'll be gone for 20 of it. So I realize that. As a researcher, I know that. I accept that fact. So I'm going to give you the bottom line up front. I'm going to give you the take-home message now of where we're going to go with this, the journey of this talk. This is not an invitation to mind wander. I ask you to use me as the focus of your attention. But this is what I want to say to you. We'll talk about attention being powerful and vulnerable. But in particular, we'll get into the details regarding high-stress intervals and the particular costs of attention for those intervals. And those intervals can be intensive training periods. They can be deployment itself. They can be a preparatory period, or even something like, for a professor, the academic semester. So there are a variety of high-stress intervals we'll talk about. Mindfulness training strengthens attention, and many aspects of what we broadly describe, and this is a military concept that I'm borrowing, the human dimension, the human being who has many different dimensions within this broader dimension of being human. And finally, when it comes to the third part of the talk, best practices in high-demand VUCA professions, there is a minimum effective dose. There is the tightest, most condensed version of training that we can give you that will produce benefits. And if you go lower than that, it's a waste of your time. And I think it's important to kind of give that reality. The other part that's important to know is that very much like physical exercise, if you discontinue it, these benefits will disappear. And the third is that when it is delivered, it is best delivered by those who know this life, who know the context in which you're offering it. And I think the wonderful introduction General Pyatt just provided shows you that. Nobody else can actually give you a sense of what it's like to benefit from it than somebody who is living a life similar to yours. All right, so that's my bottom line up front, but please try to pay attention to me, please. All right, and I think General Pyatt mentioned this, but I had the real privilege and pleasure of having a little time at lunch today with General McConville, and you know, I love this quote. People are always my number one priority. Our Army's people are our greatest strength and our most important weapon system. And as a psychologist, as a neuroscientist, I spend my entire life thinking about people and how to better them, how to strengthen them. And that's what this quote really inspired in me. What is it that makes people powerful and strong? And how are ways in which we can protect them from the vulnerabilities they would face? So in my kind of survey in preparation for coming here, what I wanted to do is know a little bit more about the DoD in general and the military in particular regarding leadership, and what do they think of, what do DoD entities think of regarding what the human dimension is, but also what are core competencies that people that are being strong and powerful have, and in particular, what are common vulnerabilities, not sort of across the board, but in particular with leadership. And so to do this, I surveyed a whole bunch of different things I could get access to as a non-DoD member, looking at what strategic and small team leaders are brought into their mind as aspirational qualities they should have, what good leaders have, and what, when leadership fails, what it looks like, as well as in the NCO, ROTC, and civilian DoD context. And what I saw across these multiple sort of standards and key competencies was common themes. And on the one hand, you know, sure, the specialization of the content knowledge differs, but what you want in a good leader is the same. And I've listed those up here. You want a focused leader, right? You want decision-making to be rational. You want problem-solving to be logical. You want somebody who's connected and emotionally balanced. And what you don't want is a distracted, disconnected, and reactive leader. I think everybody can agree we don't want this. So what I thought was very interesting is that this falls into these different aspects of the human dimension, the cognitive, the social, and the emotional. One of the things that is also in common, and this is a quote by Ron Heifetz at Harvard, is that attention has a role to play in leadership. Attention is the currency of leadership. So how can we connect the dots between these aspirational qualities, these key competencies, and attention? Well, one thing we know when we actually look at the literature on attention is that it specifically has a lot to tell us regarding where the cognitive, social, and emotional can function well and not so well. So I'm going to say a little bit more about attention now to give you a sense of what we mean when we use this term, because I think we all get what it is, but let's talk about specifically its power. And I think metaphors are a helpful way to do this. So I've got two up on the screen. Let's first focus on what is it? Your left? The flashlight, or if you, with my colleagues not from the US, a torch. least my Australian colleagues. So why is attention like a flashlight? If you're in a darkened room, or let's say you're on a dark path, and you want to make sure you maneuver well, the flashlight is going to guide you. It's going to give you more information as you go, and you're going to be able to get privileged access to that information to ensure that you can go through the path without falling, right? So attention is very similar. Wherever it is that we direct our attention, we have privileged access, more fine-grained access to that information, just like this flashlight. And in fact, the whole reason we have an attention system is because the human brain suffered from a very big problem. And that problem was that there was far more information in the environment than it could possibly process. The brain had reached its computational limits. It can't possibly deal with everything around it. So the system of attention was evolution's solution to be able to narrow and focus. So at least if I can't know everything, I can know a lot about what I'm directing those brain resources to, right? So the flashlight is very handy because it actually tells a really good story regarding attention. It can be directed. You can select what you want to pay attention to, and you can direct it. And that's not only for the external environment, right, to have situational awareness about what's going on, but you can actually direct that flashlight to the internal environment. So, for example, if I ask you, think back to what you had for lunch. Anybody have a problem doing that? So we do this seamlessly, right? What actually happened in that moment? Your long-term memory said, oh, what was that? Is it a sandwich, a salad? Oh, yeah, it was a sandwich. You recalled it, your flashlight was shining on it, and then you were able to report it back to yourself. So we do this all the time, but it's very important to realize that we shine that flashlight not only to memories, but to our emotions and our thoughts as well. That's how we're able to process and use the entirety of the brain to narrow. The other thing that's really interesting about this is that we can narrow and broaden. We can change the aperture of attention. So I hope this gives you a sense of why this would be such an important system. And the other image I've got up here is of a whiteboard. And it ends up that attention and this other metaphor of the whiteboard, something we call working memory, work hand in hand. Whereas attention selects the information, the whiteboard is what keeps the information in an active state so we can work with it. So it's a whiteboard that's very peculiar. It's a whiteboard with disappearing ink, right? So it's only up there for a little period of time. So to give you a sense of how working memory works, I think of the last time you were having a conversation and you're getting into kind of a real back and forth with somebody, and you've got a really good point you want to make, but you're not rude, right? You're not going to just blurt it out. You're holding it in your mind to have the right moment to speak. You just used your working memory. You had that on the mental whiteboard, and then when the appropriate moment arrived, you deployed that information into the conversation. It's not something you need forever, so don't get thrown off by the term memory. It really is around the working aspect of this. And it ends up that attention and working memory, working hand in hand, are important for almost every single thing we do. Your ability to even look at me and listen to me, understand my words, things like decision-making, emotion regulation, problem-solving require these systems. Okay? So given that, let's go back to our core leader competencies. The other thing that we know is that when attention and working memory are poor, all aspects of the good stuff, the good competencies that you want, are diminished or decreased. And the power of the unfortunate negative side becomes more prominent. So we have more distractibility, disconnection, and reactivity. And you might say, okay, well, if we know this, that people that have poor attention aren't going to be great leaders because they can't do these basic things, let's just select for it so that we have leaders that actually have strong attention. And that's typically what's done. But unfortunately, I have bad news for you. Regardless of how strong your attention is, it's still vulnerable. Okay? And one of the things that we've been able to do in our research is track its vulnerability. So what I'm showing you here, and you'll see more slides like this, I'm going to unpack it for a second. We actually, in time, will take samplings of your attentional performance. You come into the lab, we'll hook you up to a wonderful brain cap, or more simply have you do a simple video game where we can track your attention. And then a few days to weeks to months later, we'll have you come back and do the same thing again. And what we usually do is try to time our assessments so that you've experienced a high-stress interval. It could be readiness training, field training, pre-deployment training, deployment itself, you name it. These are various aspects of high-stress intervals. And what happens reliably across many different contexts is attention declines. And it doesn't really matter what your starting point is. All right, so what does this mean? This means that leaders who have strong skills will still become compromised, and we're all vulnerable. And that dotted line, if you can see it, is essentially sort of the normative level we might have when we're not under a high-stress interval. Right? Just sort of typical life, we might have little ups and downs, but we're pretty stable over time. So keep this in mind as we're talking through this, because this is not a good thing, and this means that the topic of your attention is actually relevant no matter what. We're unfortunately not all protected. So let's think about this a little bit. You know, I described what attention is, and I described to you that stress actually compromises it over these high stress intervals. Why would that be? What is stress doing to attention to compromise it? And this requires, if you'll go with me, another metaphor of the mind. Does everybody know what this thing is? Yes, right? MP3 player or video player of some sort. And I think General Pyatt alluded to this. This is essentially a metaphor of the mind. Our minds are fantastic at rewind and fast forward, right? And when we rewind the mind, it's our productive way to reflect on past experiences, to gain knowledge and learning that helps us. We need it, right? Or to just savor what has happened in the past. We also are fantastic at fast forward. We need to be able to plan for the future. And these important qualities, I think, are what gives us as human beings our ability to do complex stuff. But it ends up that this thing, and I won't leave it up for too long because it's kind of stressful, stress actually takes these processes in overdrive, all right? So now under high stress intervals, you're not simply reflecting on the past, you're ruminating, you're reliving, you're regretting experiences that have already happened. And under stressful circumstances, you're not just productively planning for the future, but you're catastrophizing and worrying about events that frankly haven't happened yet and may never happen, right? So this capacity that the mind has to fast forward and rewind when in overdrive and under high stress is a big problem. And that's why I have up there, a stressed mind is a wandering mind. And let me just be clear on what I mean when I say the word mind wandering or a wandering mind. Because some people might say, oh, well, I like going for a walk and letting my mind, wander as it will. And that's a wonderful thing, by the way, but that's not what I mean here. When I use the term mind wandering, it's that 50% I was talking about. Having off-task thoughts during an ongoing task or activity. There is something you want to do. You want your attention placed on the matter at hand, but your mind is not there. It is somewhere else. And typically that means it's in the past or the future. And mind wandering is annoying if you don't, especially if you're trying to interact with somebody and they're mind wandering, that's very annoying. But the problem is that it is particularly bad for information processing. The one thing we know, there's actually 3 really important things to think about with mind wandering. The first is that when you are mind wandering, it's called perceptual decoupling. Your ability to receive input from your perceptual environment, sights and sounds, for example, is diminished. It's almost like you don't hear or see as clearly. That's a problem. The second thing we know is when people are mind wandering, this may seem obvious, they're error prone. They just make more mistakes at what they're trying to do. And the third is actually important when it comes to our psychological health. Some colleagues at Harvard who actually wrote a paper about mind wandering called "A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind." Capture it in the title. One thing we know is that regardless of what it is you wander about, even if it's a wonderful vacation you're going to have, the next moment after you've been mind wandering tends to be riddled with a little bit of negativity. And we see this reliably across many different populations. So you're going to hear things and see things less clearly, you're going to make more errors, and you're going to have less positive mood and more negative mood. So there are a lot of costs to this. Now, you might say, okay, well, I won't do that, right? I just won't mind wander. What are we going to do instead? Well, the obvious thing is keep that button on play, right? Be in the present moment. Live in the unfolding of your life. And that's where the term mindfulness comes from, and that's what it's describing. And I'll give you this sort of academic definition here. It's a mental mode, a way of making the mind, characterized by attention to present moment experience without conceptual elaboration or emotional reactivity. I'm sorry about the mouthful. So let's get out of psychology speak and just tell you what I really mean. It means to be in the here and the now without a story about it, right? Without editorializing about it, without having a director's cut of your life. Right? Everybody knows what I'm talking about. You see a video and it's like, well, what I really meant to do in this scene was, we do this all the time as we're living our lives. We're not just experiencing our lives. We have a story that we are actively creating about what this is. And mindfulness is a different mode of making the mind. It's a mode of making the mind that's not only present-centered, but it doesn't have this quality of editorializing. All right? Now, one of the reasons that it's not simply enough to say, okay, I just won't mind wander anymore, is because I'm sorry to tell you, but the brain is built to mind wander. As I said, 50% of our waking moments, we mind wander. And we're going to get into discussion during the question and answer about why evolution might have built in mind wandering. But what's worse is that the rate of mind wandering increases under high stress. Okay? So there's a strong predisposition or preponderance of the brain to not want to stay in the present moment. And if we don't train our brain to actively try to do this, we will get caught up in the grips of rumination or worry or catastrophizing. So I hope that gives you a sense of what this concept is. For all of you who raised your hand that had some familiarity with mindfulness, does this resonate with your understanding of it? Okay, great. All right, so mindfulness, I think one of the reasons many people raised their hand is because there's a lot out there about mindfulness, and that's what I want to talk about next. I mean, there's beautiful magazine covers that have ethereal-looking women that are, I want to have this, right? I want to be mindful. I want to do that. But I have to say, it's not just ethereal women. It's a lot of dudes doing mindfulness too, and a lot of major organizations that are now incorporating this, not only for their C-suite executives, but for all of their workforce to ensure that they have access to what science now says is a great strategy, not only for wellness, but performance optimization. So it's growing in its prevalence and its availability. So what is the strategy that has been taken with regard to the research on mindfulness, right? There is a lot of, I wouldn't even call it just understanding or awareness. There's hype. There's a lot of mindfulness hype, but thankfully, the scientific research has paralleled this increase, and now there's been sort of an explosion of mindfulness research being published. And I'm showing you this because this is sort of, in the physical exercise or physical health domain, there has been a whole host of stuff done as well, about 300,000 articles on this relationship between physical fitness and physical health. We're not quite there with mindfulness, but the field is using a similar approach. Just like physical exercise, we can talk about the utility of mindfulness to regain or recover from illness. It could be psychological illness or even physical illness. Or thinking about wellness and sustaining our wellness over a period of time. Or being an Olympian of mindfulness, if you will, and really optimizing your attention. So I just wanted to connect it with an area that is very common in our culture to think about physical activity. And so how is mindfulness being introduced in these ways? There are many, many programs now available. I'm showing you and naming two here that are very well studied: mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and mindfulness-based stress reduction. And of course, there's intensive retreats that you can go on to really gung-ho meditate 12 hours a day if you choose to. Anybody want to sign up? So why am I mentioning these? Because I want to give you a sense of this literature, this strong and growing literature on mindfulness, what kind of programs are being studied and offered to people really in the civilian setting. And both of these programs, MBCT and MBSR, are about 8 weeks. They take 24 plus hours of time to get the formal training. It takes a few years to get trained up as a trainer in it. And you're asked to do daily homework. In addition to coming to the class, you're asked to do daily homework about 45 minutes a day, all right, on your own. And the benefits are there. What we know when we look at people that have taken these programs is that they benefit. And one in particular group that is benefiting is from the military medical literature. There's now, we're not just talking about 1 or 2 studies, 52 studies that suggest that this is a really good strategy for major depressive disorder and PTSD in both active duty and veterans, okay? So what I'm saying is that this amount of time is a good, is very beneficial, even for military cohorts in the medical context. And the larger civilian literature, where there are many people that are taking these courses, finds that mindfulness training can, yes, strengthen attention. It can strengthen a whole host of cognitive functions. It can also strengthen a whole host of social aspects, so team cohesion, for example, as well as emotional aspects of our functioning, our emotion regulation, but also disorders like PTSD, anxiety, depression, suicidality. These are all benefited. So now that I've talked about what this thing is, right? I've talked about it as a concept, press play. I've talked to you about the benefits of doing this and the large literature that's growing in the civilian setting. But unless you're a practitioner, you don't really know what this thing is. So I thought I should explain to you, kind of under the hood, what one of the practices is. And you can really think of it very similar to a physical fitness regime. There's a whole host of exercises you do that we collect together and teach people in these programs. So Let me just describe one of them. So this is something called mindfulness of breathing. It's sort of a foundational exercise that's done. And I want you to listen very carefully to what my instructions are in this. And if you're up for it, do you want to do it? You guys brave enough, though? You sure? All right, so let's just do it. I'll explain it to you as you do it. So the first instruction is sit in a comfortable, upright, and alert posture. All right, and I'll expand a little bit of these. And for this period of time, just feel free to reduce all the external stimulation that might be happening. Feel free to close your eyes or lower your eyes as you choose, whatever you're comfortable with. Okay? All right. So now think about that flashlight I described. The first thing I want you to do as you're sitting there with your eyes lowered or closed is just experience your body sitting. Right? Your feet are on the ground. Feel the contact points with the ground. Feel your seat on the chair, your back against the chair. You're sitting. And you're breathing. So just experience yourself breathing for a few seconds. The next thing I want you to do is take that flashlight of your attention and direct it towards sensations tied to your breath. Pick something that's prominent. So it could be the coolness of air moving in and out of your nostrils, or maybe your abdomen moving in and out, or your shoulders, whatever it is that's prominent for you. Just take your attentional flashlight and shine it on that. That should be the focus of your attention for the next few minutes. Just maintain your focus there. Now, if it hasn't happened already, you may notice that your mind wanders. And when you notice that wandering, all you need to do is simply redirect that flashlight back to the breath-related sensations. You're focusing on the breath, noticing, redirecting. Don't forget to notice if the mind wanders. All right, and in the next moment or two, when you feel ready, just go ahead and open your eyes or raise your gaze and return your attention back up to me. All right, so everybody survived that. Everybody has a breath, so everybody was able to do the practice, hopefully. How was that? Was that easy? I would say that was probably not easy if this is your first time doing it. In fact, the first time we ever tried to introduce this to a bunch of strong, forceful, burly Marines, one of whom is actually in the room, they freaked out. They're like, "Ma'am, this is impossible." And I was like, you get dropped in the middle of nowhere and have to find your way back, and focusing on your breath is hard, right? It's hard. And I appreciate that. It really is hard. And that's actually why we don't just say it's nothing, it's actually a push-up. It really is like a push-up. Push-ups are hard, right? And what are the elements of the push-up? And in fact, this term, push-ups for the mind, I directly stole from General Pyatt, which is what he described it as when we first introduced the practices to him. What is the push-up? What are the elements of the push-up? Focus, right? I told you to select the sensations, maintain your sensations on that content, in this case, breath-related sensations. Notice and redirect. That's the repetition. Focus, maintain, notice, and redirect. And it may seem like a simple thing, but it actually has very profound effects. So I want to continue talking about that. But I'm glad you got a taste of it. Now, if it felt hard or you didn't want to try, I ask for your curiosity. Think about how it might be beneficial to try maybe for a few more minutes. We did maybe not even 3 minutes, so. All right, so we already did some push-ups, so we did our exercise, check. So let me now tell you what this is not, because a lot of times, again, as an attention researcher, I understand. Sometimes I say words, but that's not what's heard. So I want to say what this is not. This is not about deep breathing. Now, I'm saying that for two reasons. The first is that, did I say anything about deep breathing? No, I did not. And the reason is because this exercise is not about manipulating the breath. The breath is just a handy tool. We have it with us wherever we go. If we don't, we have bigger problems, right? We have it wherever we go. And in a very discreet way, we can just focus on it. Handy. Now, if you do deep breathing, it's very beneficial. Yogic breathing is very beneficial. Diaphragmatic breathing, important, do it. That's not what we're talking about here. In fact, you can be mindful and do deep breathing at once, but that's not the beginner exercise, okay? So it's not about the deep breathing manipulation, it's just attention to the breath. It's not a way to shut down all thoughts, right? I never said, and now don't think, right? Don't clear your mind, because frankly, again, if you're alive and conscious, you can't. It's not possible. The mind is a thought-pumping, thought-generating machine. So it wasn't around clearing the mind or not having thoughts. It was an acknowledgement that the mind will just do this. The mind will generate thoughts, and in that moment, just simply return your attention back once you notice it. And the other thing is that it's not really a relaxation technique. I felt more relaxed, actually, after we did this together, and the room felt a little more calm. So it can produce relaxation, but the intention for the practice is to become more alert and more attentive. All right? And one of the reasons it can feel relaxing is because when the mind's not jetting back and forth between the past and the future and is just present, there is a stillness to that that can actually calm. Okay? A lot of people use this practice to try to fall asleep at night when the mind is all over the place. All right, and this last thing I'll say, last couple things, is that it's not esoterical. It's not going to be, to say this again, as an Indian woman, sometimes people think they might start levitating, or I don't know what assumptions they might have about what this practice does. But there is no special state we're going to achieve. That's good news and bad news. There's nowhere to go. It's just really being right here, right? There's no fancy bells and whistles. It's about showing up to what's happening. All right, and the final thing is that you don't need to do this for hours and days on end. You don't need to go to an intensive meditation retreat to benefit. We find benefits with as little as 12 minutes a day, and in some other studies, 15 minutes 3 times a week. Okay, so it's reasonable. It's a reasonable amount of time that we're asking. All right, so, a lot of times when I offer this practice, people think, okay, well, what's the point? Okay, great, I get great at following my breath. What does this do for me? This is really not about beginning and ending at following your breath. It's about taking the strengthening of your attention by using this as a tool to do it, to apply it to different aspects of your life. In the same way, nobody really is doing push-ups because they love doing push-ups. They're doing it because they want to be strong in every other aspect of their life that might require upper body strength. Same idea. So I wanted to give you a sense of how this looks, and this is actually a quote by General Paya. It was part of a NATO paper that I wrote with General Schoonmaker and General Cardone. And so what we see and what he reported is that he said that after doing this practice for a while, I can focus and stay focused on a situation or person more easily without getting lost in thought or distracted by information being thrown at me. So select and maintain. And he also said I can watch my mind and pull it back if it gets stuck in a memory or a worry. Noticing. I can drop the story of what I think should be happening so I don't become blind to what is happening. Redirecting. It's like, my mind is caught in this one scenario. Get it back. So I wanted to mention this in particular to say, I just had you guys do this mindfulness of breathing exercises, but there's much more than that. It's about what it's going to add to your life when you're not doing the exercise. And a lot of times people will say, well, I go for a run for stress relief, and that's really helpful for me. And I'd say, go for it. Go for a run for stress relief. But the next time you're in a heated conversation, right, or a debate, or there's an important decision to make, you probably can't just take off and go for a run, right? What you probably need to do is fully be able to be there in a focused, attentive way, selecting, maintaining, noticing, redirecting. And that's what we want to achieve. All right, so what I mentioned previously, and this last part will go fast. How much time do I have left? 8 minutes. Okay, I can do it. All right, so we talked about these many studies that have been done that have found beneficial effects right across the cognitive domain and the emotional and social domains. And I even described some of the work being done in the military medical context, where there's these longer programs, 8 weeks, 24 or so hours. People are doing practice for 45 minutes a day, and they're beneficial. But when we translate that from the civilian context or the military medical context into people in the operational climate, it's a non-starter. Most people will not say they can sign up for something that requires an extra 45 minutes of their time. Would you agree? It seems like a lot. So what we wanted to do when we set out on this program of research is how can we offer these practices that would be appropriate for an operational climate so that people can actually think about incorporating these with the least amount of time. And I wanted to push the envelope, so we were going to offer things that might be too short, and I was okay with failing in those circumstances, right? Or maybe I'd be pleasantly surprised and we could push it really far to very short time demands. So the main thing to keep in mind is that, remember what we're dealing with. We're dealing with high stress intervals as degrading of attention, diminishing attention. So the goal was maybe if we offer training in these high stress intervals, we may be able to protect against this, sustain performance. And if people really go gung-ho with the workout, or we're very fortunate that our training is very helpful, we might be able to optimize their attention even under high stress. This is what we're looking for. All right, so this is just a quick slide to say we've worked with many different kind of military organizations and we've done lots of studies, but I want to give you a sense of what we found from all of this work, more as a summary idea. So the kinds of questions we asked in this work was really, what is the minimum effective dose? If I can't give this longer 8-week program, what's the shortest amount of time? If they discontinue after our program, will the benefits go away? Is it more like learning a new information where it kind of stays with you, you don't have to keep relearning it? Or is it more like a skill or physical activity where you've got to keep doing it in order to stay sharp? Right? It was kind of an open question of which one it really is. But the term mindfulness exercise may give you an idea of what we were probably thinking. It is more like exercise. And then the final point is what happens with regard to operational outcomes? It's great if our laboratory measures show benefits, but how does it actually relate to the lived life and demands? And this is a really important study that was just done in collaboration with my colleagues at the RARE. Okay, so again, cut to the chase. What we found is that when we took the program, contextualized it for the military, and now started giving it in shorter and shorter doses, we find that going for 2 weeks or 4 hours is just too short. Okay? But when you try to crunch it into that time frame, something's got to go with regard to what the program has in it. The program has exercises like the one we did, and has a lot of information typically given about stress or the physiology, et cetera. We could get rid of everything that's just information. The death by PowerPoint slides can just go, and unfortunately, I feel like I'm kind of doing that to you right now, so sorry. But if we just stick to the mindfulness exercises, we see benefits. So that's what we ended up with. After many studies, we found that 4 weeks, 8 hours, focus on mindfulness exercises, we can find beneficial effects. And then what we did, because by the way, in this last project, we call this the STRONG project. It was many, many different individual studies done. Out of all of the projects we did, guess how many trainers we had to deliver all of this training? 1. We had 1 trainer. So now when my DoD collaborators say, okay, we want to scale this, how many trainers you got? And I'm like, 1. That wasn't going to be workable. So what we instead did is we said, okay, we're going to build a new program using everything we learned here, but we're going to design it from the ground up so that people that aren't mindfulness experts can deliver it, right? And this program we called MBAT, Mindfulness-Based Attention Training. We have a 10-week trainer practicum that teaches people how to do this with ease. Yes, got it. And just giving you a sense, we don't have to get into all the details, but it really is providing a suite of practices that are going to be the workout and conversation that is really tied to the practice directly to ask questions about the experience, et cetera. So here's what we found. When we look at people over a high stress interval, if you just focus on the line in red, when we don't give them training, unfortunately, just like we predicted, their performance declines. But the exciting part I hope you see on the slide is when we offered them MBAT, we could protect against this. Their performance was sustained. Very, very exciting because this was a train-the-trainer delivery. This was people that we had just trained. They got a 10-week practicum, and they were able to deliver this successfully. So that was very exciting, sustained performance. But now the next question, of course, is, well, what happens after that, right? The program is over. Do they keep practicing? Do they keep benefiting? And I'm sorry to tell you, no, they don't. When we disengage and they stop practicing, they actually decline. They're no different than the no training group. All right, so we thought, okay, if practice is very important, because they practice during the program period, and not practicing dissolves the benefits, what if we just continue to support their practice? So kind of like physical activity, you just do it every day and support them doing it, and you see. And so that's what we did. We offered MBAT, but now we had a proctored practice component. During the training interval, looks exactly the same. There's no added benefit of having proctored practice. And by the way, the proctored practice here, one example of it was just 15 minutes at the end of daily PT. They had a mindful cool down, and they could integrate it into their daily PT routine, but they were doing these stillness practices regarding mindfulness of breath and so on. So now what happens to that proctored practice group after? If we continue it, good news is the benefits are sustained. So to answer that question, is it more like knowledge or is it more like skills and exercise? It's more like skills and exercise. If you discontinue, you don't continue to maintain the benefit. All right. So the last thing I want to tell you, which is very exciting and sort of hot off the hard drive in research terminology, are results from this collaborative project directed by Captain Nassif and Amy Adler and folks at the RARE, is that these benefits are not simply for these sterile attention tasks. This program is also producing operationally relevant benefits. So, for example, and benefits for things that make sense, they're related to attention. So MBAT helps with M4 weapons qualification in a stress shoot. It's not helping across the board. It's not helping people with more crystallized intelligence, right, which you wouldn't expect. It's training attention. So this to us was also very compelling evidence that it has operational applications that could help people in their performance. So just to summarize, we found what the minimum effective dose is. Discontinuing, unfortunately, yes, it will decline, but you can protect against it by continuing. And it's tied to operational outcomes. So does this slide look familiar? This is where we started. You're at the end now. I hope that this snapshot of the work we've been doing over the last decade has been helpful to kind of get a sense of what we mean by mindfulness and also why we have an interest in collaborating with the Department of Defense to offer it. So what we described is that, yes, attention is vulnerable, and this vulnerability is particularly poignant over high-stress intervals. Mindfulness training is helpful for attention and a whole host of things related to the human dimension. And there are best practices we can follow to guide us in what we might do next. So one final thing to say is really, if we think about the next steps, I ask that you please benefit from the effort that the DoD has funded to learn about best practices. Let's follow the science in the implementation and think about ways to continue scaling this up. We also, of course, have an interest in expanding this work to other contexts in which it hasn't been offered yet. So schoolhouse trainings and qualification trainings, looking at teams and team cohesion, offering it to DoD civilians, and also in the context of strategic high-level leadership. So I just want to end finally by thanking you all for your attention. Thank you very much. Anybody have any questions?
Try to use my command voice here. Amishi, it's great to see you again. I'm Eric Schoemaker. I've known this lady now for some time, and want to thank you for bringing her here and introducing this notion. I want to start with a little story, and then I want to talk about what you introduced in the beginning, which is how we as humans may have evolutionarily gotten to where we are with this. I mean, this is a dysfunctional aspect of how our brains operate, is what you told us. And then finally, what might be an inhibition for people to adopt this in this environment, in this professional milieu. Unless you've lived on the moon or been under a rock for the last couple months, you may not know that we're about to field a World Series winning baseball team, the Nats. We've come back from the losingest team in baseball since May 24th, and we've achieved something that hasn't been achieved since 1914. And the coach, Davey Martinez, says when he's asked, what is your strategy? He says, focus on today's game. It's 1-0. Don't tell stories about the past. Don't tell catastrophic stories about the future. He's exercising mindfulness. And as a consequence, the team has done extraordinarily well, except last night, but we won't talk about that. We'll focus on today's game. So you said it. I want to talk about this notion of cognitive elaboration. And you said it in a different way, and General Pyatt said it in a different way, and that is, quit telling the story. Quit telling the story. And I think evolutionarily, maybe we as humans got to this because at some critical point in evolution, and you and I have talked about this before, and I think we differ in this, humans learned how to tell stories. We are a narrative-generating species. We have to make a story out of everything. Even random neurons firing at night, we call dreams because we make stories out of random neurons. We are crippled by the fact that we've got to tell a story about the past and we ruminate on it, or we've got to tell a story about the future, often catastrophically, or even if it's beneficial, that future, you've just pointed out, we get depressed about the fact that reality in the future don't look like what we want it to be. In this professional milieu, we prize people who can tell stories. We call them future ops and current ops people who can do branches and sequels to every story you tell about the battle. We tell our future and current ops people, if you can't predict every branch and sequel of everything the enemy is going to do or might not do, and then tell me what we're going to do as a consequence of that, then you're not a good operator. You're not a good planner. And that's antithetical to what you're talking about. And you're telling us we should not tell ourselves stories for that period of time that we're doing mindfulness in order to be more powerful when it comes time to operate. Does that make sense?
You were paying attention.
I am. Have been. So why can't we just then make this very simple, but rather than teaching people how to focus on breath, which I do too in mindfulness training, and just tell them, anytime you hear yourself telling yourself a story, you're really going in the wrong direction. Does that make sense?
I wish that could work. I wish that we could simply tell people to not have a story. But let me just be clear, and thank you so much for just elaborating in that way. I thought that was very helpful. The message is not don't tell stories. The message is know that it is a story. Be aware that the mind is generating this content. And as we sometimes put it, don't believe everything you think. And if you don't have that humility and that psychological distancing capacity, you may believe that the story you've made up is the truth, and you may be wrong. So the key in what you said is that, part of what we're trained to do in our profession is come up with all the options and come up with the action based on those options. But if you can't actually see what's happening, you won't know which scenario you're in and which one you should implement. And what I'm suggesting is that these practices, and they do require practices because the tendency of mind to believe what you think is so strong, is that these capacities bring you to that grounding to observe so that you can then best implement the most appropriate solution. Yes.
Hi, good afternoon, ma'am. Major Kowalski, G3. I have a question regarding, you mentioned setting aside time, or at least in a study, for post-exercise, for allowing 15 minutes to practice mindfulness. And I'm assuming it's the breathing, correct?
That's one of the many practices. There are about 4 that we offer in our program.
Got it. Is this a benchmarked practice, as in the post-physical training, or is this drawn from another type of activity where this is done? I'm just curious.
I don't know what the benchmark practice is.
Well, the only reason why I would say is because, some martial arts training, post the training, they'll have a session where you actually just, will sit in a squatted position, erect, and you'll close your eyes and you'll breathe, and then you will not focus on anything. And I just wondered if that's possibly
okay.
the benchmark.
Thank you for explaining that. So these practices, this suite, even the term mindfulness, right, is actually the mindfulness meditation practice. And I use that term meditation, I snuck it in there just for a second. Just to say that, because sometimes people get a little thrown off. They're like, meditation, wait a second, no, I'm not signing up for that craziness, right? But when I use the term meditation as a brain scientist, I'm talking about engaging in certain practices to cultivate specific qualities. And that term meditation is part of every major world tradition throughout history. So it sounds like you're talking about some kind of martial arts traditions that also have those practices in them.
Yes.
Many Western philosophical traditions have it. The Stoics, for example, were talking about mindfulness. So these practices come from a particular worldview and tradition, but the way that we're offering them now is so that really they're accessible to everybody, because the practices themselves don't require holding any particular worldview to focus on the breath, or focus on the body, or expand your awareness to what's happening, or to be connected to another individual. So they're absolutely, you're keying in on to the connection to other things you're familiar with, and I want to say absolutely, right on. Even what you said, I would say it's related to, but it actually is more generalizable and much more now used in medical and professional settings.
Okay. Thanks, man.
Amishi Jha, have you thought about studying how mindfulness impacts strategic thinking? We saw a lot of the tactical thinking up here, but we're dealing in complex, interdependent systems of problems.
Right.
How does mindfulness help with that?
That's an area that the first answer is yes. I've thought a lot about it. I think that there's a lot of work we can do in this area, but General Schoonmaker just touched on one of the ways in which I think it's very helpful, in particular with strategic thinking, and that's the thinking part, right? So in some sense, what we're offering by cultivating mindfulness is the ability to focus without thinking about a particular context, no story, right? We're talking about the ability to be aware, meta-aware of what it is that you're formulating. And the third thing I'd call, it's a technical term called decentering, or psychologically distancing yourself. And all three of these, focusing, being meta-aware, and decentering, actually are antithetical to thinking, okay? So it's not about further getting into the story and the nuance, or further elaborating your argument. It's actually saying, in the midst of an argument, realize that you're in that point. Realize that you're either down a particular road or you're scattered. Realize that that perspective is narrowing you. You are in bias. You are in a biased position because you've narrowed your field of view. And you actually need to understand that that may not be the right course of action, and other things happen. So I'm very keen on working with strategic leaders to figure out a way we can offer training to learn more about how it would apply.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Jamie Moore. I'm the clinical director for embedded behavioral health across the Army. I was really intrigued by the fact that the didactic didn't make any difference, because I feel like we do the didactic sort of to get buy-in. We assume that we really have to sell people on it through the didactics in order for them to actually participate. So did you just kind of do no didactic and they just did it and liked it?
Yeah, I mean, I was also surprised, but I think it's really important information to know. So I would say it's not zero didactic, but the didactic portion is just enough framing to scaffold why we're doing this and to give enough insight into what the value would be. But it's minimal, okay? It's not 45 minutes of each session. And what we did instead, and really the analogy is pretty straightforward. If you go to a personal trainer because you want to learn how to exercise more efficiently, do you want the trainer to tell you how great exercise is? No, you just show me the workout. Do the workout with me, make sure I'm getting it right so I don't injure myself, and then support me doing it. And it's very similar to that, which is what we found. So have enough so that it makes sense, but then have the conversation and the exercises consume the time together.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, ma'am. Kent Anderson. I'm with G9. Just a quick question on more practical, I guess. You've already sold me on it, so I'm just trying to figure out how to work this into my schedule. No, but I pick up on your minimum there of the 15 minutes 3 times a week. Does it matter? Do you have to have like a full 15-minute block, or if you do it like a couple minutes multiple times a day, do you get the same kind of benefit, or?
I think that's a great question. First of all, let me just clarify. I'm not selling anything. I'm telling you what you already bought with all these grants you've given me. But I get your point. And I love the energy behind your question. It's basically saying, okay, want to get going. Let's do it. The short answer is we haven't specifically tested out the difference between 2 minutes here, 2 minutes there. What we typically do is ask for a 15-minute block, and I'll tell you why in a second. And also ask for informal periods of time. Catch as catch can. Right? So it might be taking 30 seconds before you start into your next meeting to make sure you're actually going to be at that meeting, not the last one you were just in. Or while you're walking from one meeting to the next, actually allow yourself to experience the walk. Sound familiar to anybody? So I would say the reason we want people to do 15 minutes continuously is because it's like the right amount of push-ups to do. If we just do a minute here and there, you might not get to actually experience some of the arising of a lot of mental chatter. And that mental chatter that happens, all that mind wandering, is not the enemy. You actually want that because you want to use that as an opportunity to notice it. Notice that arising to then be able to practice redirecting. So you want to have enough opportunity to actually do that repeated times during a practice session. And the other thing I want to tell you, because a lot of times people will say, well, can I combine it with my run or my exercise routine? And I would say, sure, please do. Do a mindful run. Those are always good to do, but please also consider a stillness practice. And the stillness practice point of view is that there is nothing else to focus on. And you have to kind of deal with the mental chatter that arises, right? Because the breath is, I don't know if you guys noticed, but pretty darn boring, right? You want to think about anything else, but this just, oh yeah, up and down, okay, whatever. That's what you want to work with. Does that help?
Hi, Amishi, Audrey. You mentioned the work of post-traumatic stress disorder. Could you elaborate a little bit on how this impacts that work?
Yeah, I think what I'll tell, again, I'm a neuroscientist, not a clinician, so I'm not able, I can speak in a very limited way. But the evidence now suggests that people that have active PTSD benefit from mindfulness-based practices, but there's a very important caveat here, is that the way in which they're introduced to people with active disorder is very different than the way we would introduce it to a non-clinically depressed or person suffering from active PTSD. And that is actually a critical point to raise because in some sense, if you allow the emergence of trauma-related content, it can be quite destabilizing. So you need to have the extra clinical support of being able to pay attention to it without becoming or experiencing that destabilizing aspect. Okay, so I think that's all I'll say right now is that it's found to be helpful when modified so that it's appropriate for clinical patients suffering from active PTSD.
I'm going to ask, still working? Okay. I'm going to ask Amishi to stay behind a little bit if you had one we didn't get to you, but I know a lot of you are very busy. One, for those of you who want to know how we're going to get 15 minutes in our day, we're just going to take a staff meeting and we're going to not say anything. Don't tell your husband that. The chief of staff wants a problem, and I bet you we'll get there. But we can do it. I mean, many times here when I was operations director, I did walks in the courtyard and I stopped and people thought, why is that general looking at the tree? But there were ways to do it. I think you fight to get it because if you read Dan Harris's book, 10% Happier, I really related to him because this was a high-stress guy living in a fast-paced world trying to achieve, success in his career path. And he said it's like holding a fish for 10 minutes. He just couldn't do it. He just could not do it. And I couldn't do it either. And then I found I needed to do it, and I do it everywhere I go, so I can just stop and listen. So I think if we try just a minute, just 1 minute, just try that, and I think you'll get to 15 before you know it, and you'll make it fit into your routine. So I think to the question, thanks for being here. I'm seeing you well, but for the strategic thinkers, think about the 50%. So when we're going to give our best military advice, perhaps to the President of the United States, whether we're going to wage lethal force on the country, we really need to be there, right? I mean, we really need to be there. And I think at the strategic level for us, we're always thinking about the troops here. We're always thinking about support the warfighter. But we're in a war, too. And we really need to be present in that moment. And when I was a division commander deployed to Iraq, I found this really helped me. We deal with the strategic issues to get out and listen to the issues in Kirkuk and Erbil and Kurdistan and Mosul. I mean, these were strategic issues. And we had groupthink going on in the operations center. We had analysis after analysis, and it was targeted to presentation, but okay, here's what our assessment is, boss. And if you looked at it, there was no outside perspective brought into that assessment. And I found that just listening to the people who went through this suffering and were trying to bring stability back to war-torn Iraq was a very powerful tool. It was a very powerful tool. And I remember we brought General Votel up to Erbil, and we were going to give him the typical intelligence briefing and tell him, and I said, let's just wave off and let's just drive downtown and go see, a cultural center. And he had never done it. And I remember we were looking out the window, and I just told him, I said, so this is what peace looks like. Let's not forget this while we got here. Perhaps sometimes we're overthinking in our military analysis. We forgot to look at what we're trying to achieve. People back at work buying bread, people coming up and vacationing somewhere. That's a pretty good spot when you see a Ferris wheel going in Iraq or you see a water park going. That's a sign of success. But yet we're trying to knock top leadership figures off the face of the earth. And sometimes we ignore the very success we're already seeing. So this is very relevant to strategic thinking and what all of you do every day in this building, because it's incredibly hard. And we want you. By tomorrow, this is a direct order from Director of Army Staff. You don't have to listen to me because nobody does. Let's get that to 51%. Not a big goal, for the U.S. Army. Let's go 51%. By next quarter, we'll be at 65. How's that, Dr. Jha? But hey, anyway, let's give a hand for Amishi. So thank you all. That concludes, but we'll stay behind here if you have a personal question or just want to say hello. Thank you. And then we got to get you somewhere by 1600, so we'll be good.